Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Museum of Disability. We're on month 3 now, and this month we are taking a brief detour from our stint in the 20th century, covering the Radium Girls and the French writer Colette, and we are instead going back in time 5,000 years ago to the time of the Babylonians. Before Geoffrey Sinclair, before David Gray and Don McLean, there was an ancient city at the heart of an empire. Those were Babylon references, by the way. It was the city where Alexander the Great drew his last breath, on whose quiet streets, during a festival, the first Persian king Kiros claimed an empire, whose princess Enigaldinana established the world's first museum in the 6th century BCE. It was a city of passions, of sexual freedom and hedonism, whose gates now stand tall in Berlin, Babylon, the beating heart of the Babylonian Empire. Our object this month is an Old Babylonian cylinder seal made of hematite, which is a form of iron oxide. The cylinder seal was quite a common object in ancient Mesopotamia, in particular the Old Babylonian Empire. It was used for personal signatures, which were unique to the individual, sort of like a modern identity card. And they were also used to notarize documents or as a form of product branding. There was often a drilled hole going through the centre, through which you could thread a bit of cord or leather or something to wear about the neck and carry around with you. And you could present it to the king or a messenger whenever you needed to pass something along. They were engraved, so this one was made of hematite, as I say. Usually, the Mesopotamians, they used a lot of clay. Clay was the first medium which we developed to write on. They used to use an old sort of reed stylus, which they'd press into the clay to form these bird feet-like patterns, which we came to know as cuneiform, which was the world's first writing system. But with cylinder seals, obviously they needed to be a little bit more hardy, and so they made them out of a harder material, and they'd need to engrave into the metal or into the stone, whatever they used to make the cylinder seal. Occasionally they had cuneiform symbols on them, as in the case of this cylinder seal, which is quite hard to engrave into something that wasn't clay, so it gets a little bit messy and even harder to read than usual, but we'll cover that a bit later. And they usually featured some kind of presentation scene or banquet scene, perhaps relating to the gods or the natural world. On our cylinder seal, in the centre, just beneath a crescent sun disk, is engraved a bearded warrior king. He's wearing a rounded cap and he's carrying a mace in one hand, and he's depicted facing the goddess known as Ninshubur. She, on the other hand, is displayed wearing a full-length garment and a conical headdress with a sort of tiered decoration which signifies her divinity. Ninshubur has her hands raised in supplication to the king, and behind her, slightly smaller, is a nude fertility goddess with her hands clasped in front of her, and a so-called bow-legged dwarf underneath, which will be the main focus of today's episode. Behind the king are 3 columns of cuneiform inscriptions, which, when translated or transliterated, read Ilisukal Dumuina Ninshubur Il Ninshubur, which translates to, roughly, Ilisukal, which is probably a personal name, or perhaps their profession. Cylinder seals often followed a format in the cuneiform inscriptions. They usually had a name followed by something like son of, telling you who their father was, and then they might have a goddess name and servant of that goddess. So in this case, Ilisukal is probably the personal name or profession of whoever this belonged to. Sukal also meant servant, and Ili refers to, the god or a divine being. So the personal name could mean servant of the god, but we don't know if that was, understood to mean that literally, or if it was just taken to be a personal name. Ilisukal could also be translated as envoy of the gods or messenger of the king. So the person who owned the cylinder seal may well have been a messenger to the king, or some form of royal messenger. And so it's also possible that they were referred to by this title, that they took this as a sort of assumed name or descriptor. Following that, we have Dumu Ina. Now, Dumu means son of. Ina isn't quite as clear. It doesn't follow the normal patterns of a personal name. But given the normal pattern that cylinder seals follow, we can assume that this means son of Ina. And then it's followed by the cuneiform symbol for Ninshubur, the goddess, and then Ir Ninshubur, the Ir meaning servant of. So putting it all together, we have Ilisukal, envoy of the king, Dumu Ina, son of Ina, Ninshubur, servant of the goddess Ninshubur. Now, because these were designed to be pressed into clay, the inscriptions on the cylinder seal have to be written in reverse, sort of mirror image. So typically cuneiforms read from left to right as we read English, but here we're going to be reading from right to left and then from top to bottom. So we can see the first two signs are two sort of wedge shapes, which is the Ili, the first part of the personal name or profession or god. And then we have this kind of hashed shape just to the left of those two wedges, which means Sukal, servant of, which was quite a common symbol. And so this whole first line is dedicated, presumably, to the personal name of the owner. Then following on from that, on the line below, once again starting on the right-hand side, we have the cuneiform symbol for Dumu, son of, which is this sort of triangular, almost spaceship-like shape, followed by the cuneiform for Ina. Then at the very centre of this line, we have this 8-pointed star shape, which is a cuneiform symbol Dingir. And this could mean a variety of things. It originally came from the symbol for star, but it was most commonly used before the name of a god or a goddess, to signify that the cuneiform symbols that came next were the name of a goddess. And so directly after that, we can see the cuneiform symbol for Ninshubur, which is the goddess, inscribed on this cylinder seal. And that takes us to the very end of the line. And on the third line, the bottom line, we have just one new cuneiform symbol of Ir, meaning servant of, and then we have a repetition of the goddess name, the Dingir, followed by the cuneiform symbols for Ninshubur, and that completes our 3-line inscription on this cylinder seal. So as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about this dwarf figure. Now I referred to it as a bow-legged dwarf. This is a term that's frequently used in the historical literature to refer to this common motif of a naked dancer on terracotta plaques and cylinder seals, particularly in the Old Babylonian period, which is the period this seal is from about 1900 to 1600 BCE, so about 4,000 years ago. Some historians think that these figures are supposed to be playing the lute, although some others suggest that maybe the way their arms are raised might be a protective gesture. It has been suggested that their bowed legs are representative of dancing or some kind of dancing movement, and that their short stature is merely a way of depicting perspective. As you can see, there's another fertility goddess above this figure, which is also a similar height, but has no other features which historians have pointed to as being particularly dwarfish. But there is some evidence that these figures do originate from other dwarfish gods. And it should be noted that these bowed legs and short stature are certainly recognized features of achondroplasia, which is sometimes referred to as dwarfism. And this has led to many similar pieces of ancient art being identified with dwarves. But this sort of pathologizing or diagnosing of features that are depicted in art could reduce their original intention, and we need to be quite careful to examine whether such depictions may represent physical characteristics of real people, if these were a sort of portrait, or whether perhaps they're even representing spiritual characteristics. And if these figures are indeed dancing or playing an instrument, it wouldn't even be the first instance in ancient art of dwarfs acting in the role of an entertainer or musician, who were present in the courts of Africa, Asia, Europe, and Central America, all throughout history. But the key thing is how are we supposed to interpret depictions like this? Are we to assume that little people in Mesopotamia only assumed the role of entertainers, or only as a sort of protective religious figure? Or should we instead think that these are depictions of real life people? Well, first we need to take a little bit of a look at broader ideas of disability and what disability meant in ancient Mesopotamia. So while disability, as we know it, is a modern concept, and the people who we view as being disabled in some way may not have been viewed the same way in the past, the Sumerian creation myth of Enki and Ninmah addresses some aspects of disability, and attributes their existence to the unsuccessful trials of creating humans by the goddess Ninmah. In this myth, as part of a contest, Enki claims to be able to assign these unsuccessful trials, or disabled people, specific roles in society in order for them to make a living. And these roles could reflect real parts that disabled people played in ancient Mesopotamia. In one passage, Ninmah creates a person who can't walk, and Enki appears to assign him the role of silversmith. In another manuscript of the same myth, the physically disabled person is instead replaced with an intellectually disabled person, who is assigned a position at the king's court. Although the Akkadian word for a certain kind of mental impairment, cuckoo, was also used for deafness, which suggests maybe there was some ambiguity in the way they interpreted intellectual disability, much like the ancient Greeks did. Other passages in this myth offer a more apparently negative interpretation of disability. On one tablet, a line reads, "If a woman gives birth to a boy, cripple, Izbu, the house of man will suffer." And another reads, "If a woman gives birth to a dwarf, troubles, the house of man will be scattered," suggesting that disabled people might have been viewed as bad omens. But the Babylonians saw omens in all aspects of the world, as they believed that was how the gods spoke to them. The birth of males, in particular, was associated with bad omens, although this doesn't suggest men were stigmatized in Mesopotamia. And so it seemed logical to assume that the same would be true of disabled people. They may have heralded bad omens, but this doesn't mean that the Babylonians inherently saw them in a negative light. More importantly, it's difficult to know how the Babylonians actually viewed short-statured persons, and whether they were considered less able or simply different. If any distinction was made between those who were disabled by their dwarfism and those who weren't isn't really clear. But they might have been generalized or sort of lumped together, as we can glean from those Babylonian descriptions of birth omens. When it comes to the depictions of these so-called bow-legged dwarfs, such as on this cylinder seal, we should probably view them more like motifs rather than depictions of actual people, given how depersonalized they're presented. Across the archaeological record, these figures are often shown in quite a homogeneous way, without any unique characteristics outside of their short stature, cap, and ichthyphallus, which is a scholarly way of saying erection. The fact that gods and goddesses are also depicted in these scenes is another indicator that they were probably meant to represent concepts rather than real life scenes. It may well be that little people were present in courts, although we shouldn't necessarily view the abundance of these depictions as, reflecting an unusually large proportion of little people in the population. Rather, their presence on cylinder seals and plaques and in all kinds of artwork might merely be intended to sort of conjure the image of a festival scene. Or if there was any association between little people and music in these roles assigned by the god Enki, especially given that they're often shown playing the lute, then these carvings could instead just be symbolic of music as a concept. Alternatively, they may have played an important role in presentation scenes by, as I mentioned earlier, offering a form of divine protection, which presents the disabled person in an unusually significant position of power for ancient art. So, while modern scholars have a tendency to view depictions of disabled people, and in particular short-statured persons, who occur frequently in art, as often humorous or grotesque or reflective of real-life characteristics or people, it may well be that the Babylonians used the divergent body as an expression of such highly esteemed activities as dancing, music, or even as symbols and expressions of protection. Even more tellingly, some historians believe that this motif of the bow-legged dwarf was imported from Egypt during the Babylonian period. So in Egypt, this figure would have probably been recognised as Bez, which was a dwarfish fertility god, who also had relation to another goddess, Hathor, a goddess of love, joy, dance, and music. Bez, in turn, was the god of joy and dance. And this is quite key because on this cylinder, not only may this dwarf figure represent dance or music, but it's also placed below a fertility god of similar size, who the Babylonians would have probably recognized as the goddess Inanna. And this connection of fertility and perhaps music supports the origin of this figure as Egyptian, and importantly as dwarfish. Historians also believe, as Bez was, that these bow-legged dwarfs were adopted as protective figures by the Babylonians, and like it is here, they're often depicted with one hand raised towards a warrior or goddess, as if in protection of them or whoever was wearing the cylinder seal. Here there's another small figure raising a hand to the warrior king in addition to the one beside Ninshubur, suggesting that the protection motif may have been an important element on this seal. And given that Bez is also a god who makes bringing forth easier, giving birth, it's interesting that the Babylonians may have seen this short-statured figure as one who protects and aids fertility and birth, as opposed to bringing bad luck upon birth, which cuneiform inscriptions tell us was the omen of such people. The figure on this seal is also wearing a small cap, and often does on quite a lot of seals, which we have examples of. And this could be due to a local transformation at some stage along copying the images from Egypt, which removed the Egyptian elements and rendered them more Mesopotamian or Babylonian. Bez, the Egyptian god, was depicted with a little tail between his legs, and the figure presented here, as I mentioned, is ithyphallic, which probably came from a misinterpretation of the tail by merchants who were bringing the wares into Mesopotamia. They probably saw the tail as a big penis. Who knows what that says about them? But it may have been this transformation or this misinterpretation which partly influenced the interpretation of this figure as dwarfish by Babylonians. Although, as I said, the Egyptian god was considered to be dwarfish anyway, and was the reason why little people were often considered to be of divine origin in Egypt. So it seems that these figures, they didn't just have mythological origins, but they were also probably associated with protection or dancing, or sometimes playing a dual role, such as on contest scenes, where the figure may have offered protection to the central hero who is competing in a scene, and then danced afterwards, either as entertainment or in ritual. Now, obviously, ideas like this, of these figures having not just an entertaining role, but a protecting role, are quite far removed from the more traditional academic views of disability in Mesopotamia as bad omens. But they still offer quite a depersonalized concept of disability and physical differences. If depictions like this really were symbolic of such things as dance or protection, it's hard to know how disabled people living at that time would have reacted to being viewed as, perhaps more a concept than a person. But in a culture of omens, gods, and spiritual reckonings, disabled people may have even considered it a celebration of something that even our modern culture readily dismisses, much less makes art of. And it may have offered a powerful statement to disabled people who were living at that time, that they could be not just equals to non-disabled people, but in a special position of power and protection above them. At the very least, depictions of disability in ancient Mesopotamian art can't be reduced to something that, we can call wholly positive or negative, but they are nonetheless an integral part of Babylonian motifs and imagery, whose presence highlights in some small way the existence of disabled people over 4,000 years ago. Disabled people were present on seals worn around the necks of everyday people, messengers of the kings, not hidden, but on full display. And we can only hope that the real disabled people of that period had quite as much freedom as that. Well, that is the end of episode 3. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about disability in ancient Mesopotamia. There is so much to say about ancient Mesopotamia in general, and even the gods and goddesses mentioned in this episode, I could have gone on to spend hours talking about and diving into. And so I realised if this is, maybe your first encounter with ancient Mesopotamia, or some of the terminologies of gods, then it might be quite overwhelming. But it's such a fascinating area, and there's so much to learn. So if you're interested in learning more, I will put the titles of a couple of good books about ancient Mesopotamia in the description, which you can check out if you feel like it. Otherwise, that is all for this month, and we will return with another episode next month. We are returning to the safe confines of the 20th century again next month. So I will see you then. Thank you for listening, and happy Pride.